Thankfully, it isn't my responsibility to answer that one. Oh, lucky day. Let me change the subject and say without hesitation he had a Heinz-like variety of personal characteristics that threatened, at different chronological intervals of sensitivity or thin-skinnedness, to drive every minor in the family to the bottle. In the first place, there's very evidently one rather terrible hallmark common to all persons who look for God, and apparently with enormous success in the queerest imaginable places, e.g., in radio announcers, in newspapers, in taxicabs with crooked meters, literally everywhere. My brother, for the record, had a distracting habit most of his adult life of investigating loaded ashtrays with his index finger, clearing all the cigarette ends to the sides, smiling from ear to ear as he did it, as if he expected to see Christ himself curled up cherubically in the middle, and he never looked disappointed. The hallmark, then, of the advanced religious, non-sectarian, or any other, and I graciously include in the definition of an advanced religious, odious though the phrase is, all Christians on the great Vivekananda's terms, i.e., quote, see Christ, then you are a Christian, all else is talk, end of quote. The hallmark most commonly identifying this person is that he very frequently behaves like a fool, even an imbecile. It's a trial to a family that has a real grandee in it if he can't always be relied on to behave like one. I'm now about to quit cataloging, but I can't do so quite at this point without citing what I think was his most trying personal characteristic. It had to do with his speech habits, or rather, the anomalous range of his speech habits. Vocally, he was either as brief as a gatekeeper at a Trappist monastery, sometimes for days, weeks at a stretch, or he was a non-stop talker. When he was wound up, and to state the matter exactly, almost everybody was forever winding him up, and then, of course, quickly sitting in close, the better to pick his brains. When he was wound up, it was nothing for him to talk for hours at a time, occasionally with no redeeming awareness whatever that 1 or 2 or 10 other people were in the room. He was an inspired non-stop talker, I'm firmly suggesting, but to put it very mildly, even the most sublimely accomplished non-stop talker can't consistently please. And I say that, I should add, less from any repellent, splendid impulse to play fair with my invisible reader than, much worse, I suppose, because I believe that this particular non-stop talker can take almost any amount of knocking. Certainly from me, at any rate, I'm in the unique position of being able to call my brother straight out a non-stop talker, which is a pretty vile thing to call somebody, I think, and yet at the same time to sit back, rather, I'm afraid, like a type with both sleeves full of aces and effortlessly remember a whole legion of mitigating factors, and mitigating is hardly the word for it. I can condense them all into one. By the time Seymour was in mid-adolescence, 16, 17, he not only had learned to control his native vernacular, his many less than elite New York speech mannerisms, but had by then already come into his own true, bullseye, poet's vocabulary. His nonstop talks, his monologues, his near harangues then came as close to pleasing from start to finish, for a good many of us anyway, as, say, the bulk of Beethoven's output after he ceased being encumbered with a sense of hearing. And maybe, I'm thinking especially, though it seems a trifle picky, of the B-flat major and C-sharp minor quartets. Still, we were a family of 7 children originally, and as it happened, none of us was in the least tongue-tied. It's an exceedingly weighty matter when 6 naturally profuse verbalizers and expounders have an undefeatable champion talker in the house. True, he never sought the title, and he passionately yearned to see one or another of us outpoint or simply outlast him in a conversation or an argument. A small matter which, of course, though he himself never saw it, he had his blank spots like everybody else, bothered some of us all the more. The fact remains that the title was always his, and though I think he would have given almost anything on earth to retire it, this is the weightiest matter of all, surely, and I'm not going to be able to explore it deeply for another few years. He never did find a completely graceful way of doing it. At this point, it doesn't seem to me merely chummy to mention that I've written about my brother before. For that matter, with a little good-humored cajoling, I might conceivably admit that there's seldom been a time when I haven't written about him. And if, presumably at gunpoint, I had to sit down tomorrow and write a story about a dinosaur, I don't doubt that I'd inadvertently give the big chap 1 or 2 small mannerisms reminiscent of Seymour. A singularly endearing way of biting off the top of a hemlock, say, or of wagging his 30-foot tail. Some people, not close friends, have asked me whether a lot of Seymour didn't go into the young leading character of the one novel I've published. Actually, most of these people haven't asked me. They've told me. To protest this, all I've found makes me break out in hives, but I will say that no one who knew my brother has asked me or told me anything of the kind, for which I'm grateful and, in a way, more than a bit impressed, since a good many of my main characters speak Manhattanese fluently and idiomatically, have a rather common flair for rushing in where most damn fools fear to tread, and are, by and large, pursued by an entity that I'd much prefer to identify, very roughly, as the old man of the mountain. But what I can and should state is that I've written and published 2 short stories that were supposed to be directly about Seymour. The more recent of the 2, published in 1955, was a highly inclusive recount of his wedding day in 1942. The details were served up with a fullness possibly just short of presenting the reader with a sherbet mold of each and every wedding guest's footprint to take home as a souvenir. But Seymour himself, the main course, didn't actually put in a physical appearance anywhere. On the other hand, in the earlier, much shorter story I did back in the late 40s, he not only appeared in the flesh, but walked, talked, went for a dip in the ocean, and fired a bullet through his brain in the last paragraph. However, several members of my immediate, if somewhat far-flung family who regularly pick over my published prose for small technical errors have gently pointed out to me, much too damned gently since they usually come down on me like grammarians, that the young man, the Seymour, who did the walking and talking in that early story, not to mention the shooting, was not Seymour at all, but, oddly, someone with a striking resemblance to, alley-oop, I'm afraid, myself. Which is true, I think, or true enough to make me feel a craftsman's ping of reproof. And while there's no good excuse for that kind of faux pas, I can't forbear to mention that that particular story was written just a couple of months after Seymour's death, and not too very long after I myself, like both the Seymour in the story and the Seymour in real life, had returned from the European theater of operations. I was using a very poorly rehabilitated, not to say unbalanced, German typewriter at the time. Oh, this happiness is strong stuff. It's marvelously liberating. I'm free, I feel, to tell you exactly what you must be longing to hear now. That is, if, as I know you do, you love best in this world those little beings of pure spirit with a normal temperature of 125 degrees, then it naturally follows that the creature you love next best is the person, the God lover or God hater, almost never apparently anything in between, the saint or profligate, moralist or complete immoralist who can write a poem that is a poem. Among human beings, he's the curlew sandpiper, and I hasten to tell you what little I presume to know about his flights, his heat, his incredible heart. Since early in 1948, I've been sitting, my family thinks literally, on a loose-leaf notebook inhabited by 184 short poems that my brother wrote during the last 3 years of his life, both in and out of the Army, but mostly in, well in. I intend very soon now, it's just a matter of days or weeks, I tell myself to stand aside from about 150 of the poems and let the first willing publisher who owns a pressed morning suit and a fairly clean pair of gray gloves bear them away, right off to his shady presses, where they'll very likely be constrained in a two-tone dust jacket, complete with a back flap featuring a few curiously damning remarks of endorsement, as solicited and acquired from those name poets and writers who have no compunction about commenting in public on their fellow artists' works, customarily reserving their more deeply quarter-hearted recommendations. Let me run up against that again. Customarily reserving their more deeply quarter-hearted commendations for their friends, suspected inferiors, foreigners, fly-by-night oddities, and toilers in another field. Then on to the Sunday literary sections where, if there's room, if the critique of the big, new, definitive biography of Grover Cleveland doesn't run too long, they'll be tersely introduced to the poetry-loving public by one of the little band of regulars, moderate salaried pedants, and income supplementers who can be trusted to review new books of poetry, not necessarily either wisely or passionately, but tersely. I don't think I'll strike quite this sour note again, but if I do, I'll try to be equally transparent about it. Now, considering that I've been sitting on the poems for over 10 years, it might be, well, refreshingly normal or unperverse, at least, if I gave what I think are the 2 main reasons I've elected to get up, rise from them. And I'd prefer to pack both reasons into the same paragraph, duffel bag style. partly because I'd like them to stick close to each other, partly because I have a perhaps impetuous notion that I won't be needing them again on the voyage. First, there's the matter of family pressure. It's doubtless a very common thing, if not much more common than I'd care to hear about, but I have 4 living, lettered, rather incontinently articulate younger brothers and sisters of part Jewish, part Irish, and conceivably part Minotaur extraction, 2 boys, one Waker, an ex-roving Carthusian monk reporter, now impounded, and the other Zoe, a no less vigorously called and chosen non-sectarian actor, aged respectively 36 and 29, and 2 girls, one a budding young actress, Franny, and the other Boo Boo, a bouncy, solvent Westchester matron, aged respectively 25 and 38. Off and on since 1949, from seminary and boarding school, from the obstetrical floor of Woman's Hospital and the exchange students' writing room below, the waterline on the Queen Elizabeth between, as it were, exams and dress rehearsals and matins and 2 o'clock feedings. All 4 of these dignitaries have been laying down through the mail a series of unspecified but discernibly black ultimatums of what will happen to me unless I do something soon about Seymour's poems. It should be noted, perhaps immediately, that besides being a writing man, I'm a part-time English department member at a girls' college in Upper New York, not far from the Canadian border. I live alone, but catless, I'd like everybody to know, in a totally modest, not to say cringing, little house set deep in the woods and on the more inaccessible side of a mountain. Not counting students, faculty, and middle-aged waitresses, I see very few people during the working week or year. I belong, in short, to a species of literary shut-in that I don't doubt can be coerced or bullied pretty successfully by mail. Everybody, anyhow, has a saturation point, and I can no longer open my post office box without excessive trepidation at the prospect of finding, nestled among the farm equipment circulars and the bank statements, a long, chatty, threatening postcard from one of my brothers or sisters, 2 of whom, it seems peculiarly worth adding, use ballpoint pens. My second main reason for deciding to let go of the poems, get them published, is, in a way, much less emotional, really, than physical. And it leads, I'm proud as a peacock to say, straight to the swamps of rhetoric. The effects of radioactive particles on the human body, so topical in 1959, are nothing new to old poetry lovers. Used with moderation, a first-class verse is an excellent and usually fast-working form of heat therapy. Once in the Army, when I had what might be termed ambulatory pleurisy for something over 3 months, my first real relief came only when I had placed a perfectly innocent-looking Blake lyric in my shirt pocket and worn it like a poultice for a day or so. Extremes, though, are always risky and ordinarily downright baneful, and the dangers of prolonged contact with any poetry that seems to exceed what we most familiarly know of the first class are formidable. In any case, I'd be relieved to see my brother's poems moved out of this general small area, at least for a while. I feel mildly but extensively burned, and on what seems to me the soundest basis. During much of his adolescence, and all his adult life, Seymour was drawn first to Chinese poetry and then as deeply to Japanese poetry, and to both in ways that he was drawn to no other poetry in the world. Since this is a record of sorts, I ought to mumble down here that he read Chinese and Japanese poetry, for the most part as it was written. Another time around, probably at irksome length, to me so anyway, I'm going to have to dwell on an odd inborn characteristic common to some extent to all the original 7 children in our family, and as pronounced as a limp in 3 of us, which made it possible for us to learn foreign languages with extreme ease. But this footnote is mainly for young readers. If, in the line of duty, I should incidentally titillate a few young people's interest in Chinese and Japanese poetry, it would be very good news to me. At all events, let the young person please know, if he doesn't already, that a goodish amount of first-class Chinese poetry has been translated into English with much fidelity and spirit by several distinguished people. Widder-Brenner and Lionel Giles come most readily to mind. The best short Japanese poems, particularly haiku, but Senryu too, can be read with special satisfaction when R.H. Blyth has been at them. Blyth is sometimes perilous, naturally, since he's a high-handed old poem himself, but he's also sublime. And who goes to poetry for safety, anyway? This last little piece of pedantry, I repeat, is for the young who write to authors and never get any replies from the beasts. I'm also functioning partly on behalf of my title character, who was a teacher too. Poor bastard. I have no quick way of knowing, of course, how familiar or unfamiliar my dear victimized general reader is with Chinese or Japanese poetry. Considering, however, that even a short discussion of it may possibly shed a good deal of light on my brother's nature, I don't think this is the time for me to go all reticent and forbearing. At their most effective, I believe, Chinese and Japanese classical verses are intelligible utterances that please or enlighten or enlarge the invited eavesdropper to within an inch of his life. They may be, and often are, fine for the ear particularly, but for the most part I'd say that unless a Chinese or Japanese poet's real forte is knowing a good persimmon or a good crab or a good mosquito bite on a good arm when he sees one, then no matter how long or unusual or fascinating his semantic or intellectual intestines may be, or how beguiling they sound when twanged, no one in the mysterious East speaks seriously of him as a poet, if at all. My inner, incessant elation, which I think I've rightly, if repeatedly called happiness, is threatening. I'm aware to turn this whole composition into a fool's soliloquy. I think, though, that even I haven't the gall to try to say what makes the Chinese or Japanese poet the marvel and the joy he is. Something, however, wouldn't you know, does happen to come to mind. I don't imagine it's precisely the thing I'm looking for, but I can't simply throw it out. Once, a terrible number of years ago, when Seymour and I were 8 and 6, our parents gave a party for nearly 60 people in our 3.5 rooms at the old Hotel Alamac in New York. They were officially retiring from vaudeville, and it was an affecting as well as a celebrative occasion. We too were allowed to get out of bed around 11 or so and come in and have a look. We had more than a look. By request and with no objections whatever on our part, we danced, we sang, first singly, then together, as children of our station often do. But mostly we just stayed up and watched. Toward 2 a.m, when the leave-takings began, Seymour begged Bessie, our mother, to let him bring the leavers their coats, which were hung, draped, tossed, piled all over the small apartment, even on the foot of our sleeping younger sister's bed. He and I knew about a dozen of the guests intimately, 10 or so more by sight or reputation, and the rest not at all or hardly. We had been in bed, I should add, when everyone arrived, but from watching the guests for some 3 hours, from grinning at them, from, I think, loving them, Seymour, without asking any questions first, brought very nearly all the guests, 1 or 2 at a time, and without any mistakes, their own true coats, and all the men involved their hats. The women's hats he had some trouble with. Now, I don't necessarily suggest that this kind of feat is typical of the Chinese or Japanese poet, and certainly I don't mean to imply that it makes him what he is, but I do think that if a Chinese or Japanese verse composer doesn't know whose coat is whose on sight, his poetry stands a remarkably slim chance of ever ripening. And 8, I'd guess, is very nearly the outside age limit for mastering this small feat.